Now, London's cab drivers have formed a group to bring a potential £1 billion legal action against Uber, as revealed by Sky News last month. The Cabby Group action says the ride-hailing app has operated unlawfully and it will be seeking damages and alleged loss of earnings. To discuss this, joined by Peter Rose from Unite the Union, who's also a London taxi driver, and Rebecca Lowe, who's a research fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thanks very much both for joining us. If I can start with you, sir. How did you come to that £1 billion figure? How do you judge loss of earnings?
Well, loss of earnings. Loss of earnings is will be calculated on what we feel that the amount Uber owes us because of the way they acted, and they admitted they acted in an unfair way in court.
Is your legal battle not with TfL rather than Uber? If they have acted in an unfit and they were found to be not fit and proper, surely the problem is with the regulator rather than the service?
No, Uber is operating as a disruptive service. And in last September, Transport for London and the Mayor of London decided to actually remove their licence because they found to be unfit and proper. They've been
operating for several years as an unfit and proper. So did you not think about taking TfL to task?
We have taken TfL to task many times over the regulation of Uber and the fact they wasn't following regulations to the letter of the law. This has happened many times regarding telephone lines that there was a requirement, premises that was a requirement, planning permission that was a requirement under the 1998 Act. All of those were ignored by Uber.
OK, Rebecca, what do you think of this? Legitimate grievances from the Cabby Action Group here?
So, yeah, I mean, disruption is when new entrants enter often a highly regulated market and manage to beat down monopoly interests and offer higher standards, more efficiency, more transparency. That's what's happening in the case of Uber. So I don't necessarily see why somebody would have a problem with disruption unless it was their vested interests which were being disrupted. First of all, I think it's super important to note that part of the essence of the rule of law is that people can seek to uphold their entitlement by going to court and hearing the adjudication from an independent judiciary. So obviously no criticism of that. But there's just a couple of things. One is indeed this point about why it is the entrant to the market rather than the regulator who LTDA are seeking to criticise here. And the second point is it's quite depressing to see this rise of judicial activism. I mean, this is something across various markets, but particularly with Uber, we see in lots of countries that interests come together, monopoly interests, and they seek to try to use judicial activism rather than raising their own standards. Just quite depressing, really. OK,
Peter, your response to that, judicial activism, and basically you just don't like competition.
I think I've been competing with 25,000 other cab drivers all my cab driving career. I've also been competing with other private hire services apart from Uber, and all those other private hire services have always managed to conduct their business in a fair and reasonable manner, and have always adhered to the rules. If we are talking about disruption of apps, a company such as Addison Lee, which is a large operator in London, has actually originally developed their apps totally within the regulations. So you can offer more services within the regulations. That's not an issue. But if you choose to disrupt regulations and indeed ignore them, then there obviously is going to be problems. Yeah, which is why their license was removed last September.
Indeed, Rebecca, does Peter not have a point that Uber specifically, and they admitted themselves, have fallen short of the regulations, therefore they have not been a sort of genuine enter into the market in the true spirit of competition?
So my understanding is that Uber won their appeal against TfL. And remember, TfL is a regulator for black cabs as well. Now, you speak about competition within taxi, different competing taxi owners or taxi drivers, but actually, I mean, there's quite a high level of regulation that taxi firms face as set in place by TfL. I believe that their pricing structure, their tariffs, their rates are set in place. I think if taxi firms have frustrations, I imagine it's with the regulator, who, after all, have just licensed Uber again. They've been doing that for a number of years, and they've just given them an extra 15 months. So again, I kind of struggle to see why the frustration is with the entrant to the market who is driving up standards, and indeed has dealt well, I think, and responded to the criticisms. Remember, I mean, often there are frustrations around, people complain that there are safety disparities between black cabs and Uber, but it's exactly the same regulator, TfL, who does DBS standard checks on Uber drivers and on taxi drivers. So again, I mean, we've basically got more of an even playing field in terms of regulation across the standards that TfL sets. If Uber manages to offer a better service and more people use, I think like 3.5 million people use Uber. There's a lot of people. There's 40,000 Uber drivers. I don't quite see where the frustration is with the entrant to the market unless it's to uphold vested interests.
Okay, going back to this point, Peter, then, about TfL versus Uber and who you're seeking action against. You engaged Mission Durea, I think, the firm, to sort of explore this for you. Did they say to you, you have more likelihood of winning if you go after Uber than TfL?
Well, Transport for London wasn't the disruptive entity. Uber was. I mean, and they actually admitted that in court last month. You know, they actually said that Transport for London were actually right in removing their licence because they had conducted misdemeanours under that while it was licensed. Typically, in relation actually to reporting serious crime. Let's not forget Grable, the software which actually stops the authorities from actually checking to make sure everything was above board. And the DBS fiasco, where they chose to use someone carrying out criminal records checks that actually wasn't approved by Transport for London, which Transport for London are actually entitled to require.
As Rebecca said, Peter, millions of customers using Uber. More importantly, I suppose, the 40,000-ish drivers. What would you say to them today?
Well, I think we should make something absolutely clear, is that Uber actually employs no drivers. None of those drivers are employed by Uber. Uber doesn't give them holiday pay, sick pay, or any kind of minimum earnings that they can do when they go to work. So let's not be under any illusion that Uber is some kind of benefactor for the private hire trade. They actually employ no one. They are looking after no one apart from themselves.
Oh, Rebecca, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, just looking for your reaction there. The fact that there's 40,000 of those Uber drivers, Peter says, in fact, that Uber aren't taking care of them anyway. It's
a slightly strange approach to try to help workers or help independent contractors as they are by taking them to court, or by taking the person who provides their livelihood in terms of their access to jobs. I think there was an independent poll. I'm sure that taxi drivers have heard about this quite a lot last year, done in September by ORB, I think. 1,000 Uber drivers across London surveyed, and I think some 90% said that they worked for Uber because they wanted to be their own boss, and 80-odd% said that they wanted to remain as independent contractors. That said, there is an important point here. We're seeing also in America, in response to the Supreme Court of California ruling, that there is need to address the kinds of ways in which we regulate industries and whether some of those regulations are too heavy in a world in which more people want access to flexible working, whether that's because they want access to education through their life, whether that's because they want to do some working on the side. This kind of response, which can also often help poorer people or younger people by offering them more flexibility, we maybe need to respond to how we see work in this sense. So I think, of course, there are some legitimate questions about that, but the answer is not to, I find it strange to see that the answer is to try to take the employer to court rather than the regulator again.
Just finally, Peter, last question. If Uber do meet the standards for the regulator, as we believe they are trying to do, you're happy for the competition?
Absolutely. There's absolutely nothing wrong with competition. But what we are arguing that from the period of their licensing in 2012 up until their licence removal in 2017, they were actually skirting the regulations and actually acting as a predatory competitor outside of regulations. And can I just add one last thing regarding regulation and why regulation is important? I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that regulations are there for the safety of the public. The London taxi trade has been regulated since the days of Oliver Cromwell, and we trace our history back to that. And the archaic laws that's sometimes referred to by the private hire trade and companies like Uber, it's actually only 20 years old. The 1998 Private Hire Act is only 20 years old. and implementation of that act only happened in the early turn of the century. So this is not archaic regulation.
Okay. Peter Rose, Rebecca Lowe, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for your time today.
Thanks.